The Life of All For One Update. All For One, surname Shigaraki, is the overarching antagonist of the My Hero Academia manga and anime series. He's the founder and benefactor of the League of Villains. Once Japan's most powerful villain and All Might's arch-nemesis, his full identity is unknown. His ultimate goal is to steal his younger brother's quirk, one for all, the only quirk that can oppose him. He is the mentor of Tomura Shigaraki, having spent the young villain's life shaping him into his successor, and a vessel for his power in a plan to eventually conquer the world as a self-proclaimed demon lord. He was imprisoned in Tartarus after his second defeat at All Might's hands until he escaped several months later, now single-mindedly focused on destroying the 9th wielder of One for All, Izuku Midoriya, to complete his century-long plan. Welcome to the Amagi. In today's video, we're going over the life of All For One. Before we begin, we publish a new video every day, so be sure to subscribe to our channel and ring the bell to get notified about our latest videos. The Amagi's reach stretches beyond just this channel, so if you're a fan of us, please consider subscribing to our other channels and following us on all of our social media. Help us reach our goal of passing 100,000 followers on all of our accounts by the end of the year. And with that out of the way, let's get into the video. Background. When they were kids, the Shigaraki brothers used to read Captain Hero comics. The younger brother, Yoichi, was a fan of the titular protagonist, Captain Hero, while the older brother was a fan of Captain Hero's nemesis, the Demon King. The older brother read only to volume 3 of the series, but he stopped because he didn't like the cliched ending between hero and villain. Since then, he dreamed of being a Demon King and creating the world just like the comics. The introduction of quirks to the world led to a period of societal collapse and an age of upheaval. During this time, the older brother manifested an overwhelmingly powerful quirk known as All For One, which he proceeded to name himself after and rose through the ranks in Japan. He decided to exploit the chaos, stole many quirks, and attained immense power and influence. Using his incredible might, the man unified thousands of people under his command. He then manipulated the people he gathered like pawns to further his plans and eventually became the ruler of Japan. It's suggested that he ruled from the shadows, as most of his actions in the present day are only known as rumors on the internet. He also started grooming other powerful individuals who he deemed to have a lot of potential, such as Gigantomachia, who became his personal bodyguard, though when this happened is unknown. All For One was accused of atrocity for his actions by his younger brother, Yoichi. All For One claimed that he was only helping people by taking away undesirable quirks and giving power to the weak, thus contributing to restoring humanity in a chaotic era. He then gave a demonstration on how he used his quirk to help others and presented two people, a young man with a quirk that gave him a mutant jaw. He caringly looked after his grandparents but was shunned by society because of his facial appearance. Even his parents wouldn't speak with him. And an ordinary man who was attacked by a group of quirk users with the stun gun he relied on being rendered useless. All For One then used his power to take away the young man's quirk, subsequently removing his mutant jaw, and giving the other man a quirk proficient for self-defense. After doing so, All For One asks the two if he can call on them in times of need, and both men swear their allegiance to him in gratitude. Yoichi, however, pointed out that All For One was only conducting subtle schemes as to gather followers and would dispose of them after they became worthless to him. Yoichi refused to give in to his brother's sophistry and tried to rebel, but was stopped by All For One's personal bodyguard. All For One berated his brother for not having a quirk, but said that he still loved him as he's his only family, and imprisoned him rather than having him killed. When All For One visited his captive brother, he saw how emaciated he had become. He tells Yoichi about how a group who refused to join him were killed, simply because his followers interpreted his desires as instructions to kill them. Yoichi was disgusted and voiced his defiance against his brother. Insulted, All For One then used his quirk to foist a power stockpiling quirk on Yoichi in order to make him submit to him as well as to make him more powerful. What no one knew at the time is that Yoichi already had an innate quirk which could only be transferred to others. The two quirks merged to form a new quirk, One For All. It was during this time when All For One met Kyudai Garaki. Kyudai theorized the quirk singularity, according to which someday quirks will become so powerful that they will be uncontrollable, but society scoffed at this theory, so he disappeared from the public eye. However, possibly due to the nature of his own quirk, All For One believed this theory and lent Kyudai his aid. Since then, Kyudai has been working for All For One. As a gift of loyalty and appreciation, Kyudai duplicated his life force quirk and gave his original quirk to All For One, keeping the duplicate. Thanks to this, both he and All For One continue to live to this day. Battle against the One For All's users. It was during this time when All for One was being opposed by a resistance led by a spiky-haired man, the future second user of One for All, and while he had no direct confrontation with this resistance, he allowed his growing number of subordinates to deal with them and the rest later. At some point, the second user and his companion, the future third user, rescued Yoichi from his imprisonment after deciding against his initial assassination attempt. Yoichi was not strong enough to defeat his brother even with his new quirk, so he passed it on to the next generation in the hopes that one day, One for All would be strong enough to defeat his older brother. Sometime after Yoichi passed down One for All to the second user, he was targeted by All for One, massacring the entire resistance, leaving only the second user standing to oppose him. Even with One for All, the second user wasn't strong enough to defeat All for One. However, by this point he had already passed down the One for All to the third user. All for One, with tears flowing down his eyes, begins to choke the second user out, easily stopping a bullet shot at him from behind using his meta ability Gear Shift. All for One eventually kills the second user, and while in his final moments, he simply smiles at the villain in satisfaction. Throughout the century, All for One became obsessed with acquiring One for All and sought out every successor who obtained it. He fought and killed nearly all of these successors. He even attempted to steal One for All from the 5th and 6th users, but failed to due to its inherent willpower and refusal to submit to All for One, as the quirk continued to be passed on. Several generations later, the 7th torchbearer Nana Shimura with her pupil and 8th bearer Toshinori Yagi and her friend Sorihiko Torino tried to stop him. However, despite their best efforts, All for One still overwhelmed them. Aware that they could not defeat him, Nana pushed Torinoshi out of harm's way, and Grand Torino fled with Torinoshi as the young man cries out for his master. Nana imparted some final words of encouragement onto Torinoshi before standing against All for one last time. The villain mocked her for providing quality comedy and killed her with a large flash of black lightning. A few decades later, after Tenko Shimura accidentally murdered his family during the awakening of his quirk, All for One met him under a bridge and granted him a home and safety. He provided Tenko a home and guidance to overcome his violent urges. Kyudai entered the room with Tenko's family's dissected hands, causing the boy to suffer a mental breakdown remembering his family. Kyudai questioned whether All for One should modify Tenko. All for One replied no, and that he would teach him how to take his feelings and frustration and give them purpose. All for One told Tenko that he had an impulse to destroy that couldn't be controlled. He assured him that the impulse didn't have to be controlled, nor was it necessarily a bad thing. One day, Tenko got into a fight with two punks. He was going to fight back and uses the decay on them, but backed down. Later, he threw a tantrum while All for One tried to console the young Tenko, telling him that he should act as his heart commands, otherwise he would suffer for it. He explained that conscience, morals, and ethics were all fabrications intended to restrain people like them. He asked Tenko one more time what he would like to do. Tenko replied that he wanted to kill the two street thugs, noting that he couldn't hold back his feelings anymore. He disintegrated one of the hands, and All for One smiled and told him to try his best. On a rooftop nearby, All for One and Kyudai watched Tenko murdering the street punks. Garaki expressed surprise at the events, saying he thought that Tenko had lost his memories. All for One corrected him, noting that the memories were still there, just shut away. He noted that his family's hands would serve to restrain him, keeping all of his negative emotions suppressed. He saw that Tenko was subconsciously keeping his quirk in check. Smiling, All for One expressed pride in seeing Tenko's first step down the path to becoming the symbol of fear, and said that he will cultivate and encourage him on the journey. Later, All for One awarded Tomura with 5 dissected hands, 4 belonging to the 2 thugs he killed, and explained that the 5th hand is a small bonus to make up for the one he destroyed earlier. He asked Tenko to put on all the new hands and rechristened him Tomura Shigaraki, as Tomura means to mourn and Shigaraki is his own surname. After this, All for One began grooming Tomura as his successor and as the new symbol of fear, knowing that this growing raw hatred of his could be used to finally steal One for All. All for One was also aware that Tomura was suppressing his memories and his quirk. The threat of All Might. Toshinori Yagi, Nana's disciple, returned to Japan after a long absence in the United States and soon became All Might, Japan's #1 hero and the symbol of peace. All for One attempted to stop All Might with his soldiers and accomplices, though All Might was able to best all of them, and with his actions, All Might began to dismantle All for One's criminal empire. All for One began to suspect that he would eventually be defeated, so he took several contingency measures in case this would happen, such as sending Gigantomachia away into the woods for hiding. Likewise, in collaboration with Garaki, All for One duplicated his own quirk, with the intention of transferring it to Tomura once the time comes. In the meantime, Kyudai utilized the duplicate of All For One for various experiments. At some point, All For One recovered the body of the deceased Oboro Shirakumo and had Kyudai turn him into Nomu called Kurogiri, which served as their close confidant and assistants. He also at one point was approached by the Aoyama family and asked to give a quirk to their quirkless son, Yuga. He gave him Naval Laser. However, like everyone he made deals with in the past, the Aoyamas were now indebted to All For One, and would be forced to follow his commands in fear of death, showing them the bloody remains of those who attempted to act behind his back. All For One and Kyudai also took in many children, which they described as warped, twisted seeds that they could manipulate as a part of their own experiments, as well as use for spare vessels in case anything happened to Tomura. One of these people was a young nameless boy only known as Experiment Number 6. He suffered from a case of agnosia, having absolutely no awareness of his own self, whether due to a brain defect or childhood trauma. While Kyudai believed his state to be unfit as a pupil, All For One disagreed, seeing his blank slate as someone they could shape like a wad of clay into whatever form he desires, potentially even the twisted entity they seek. All For One showed him videos and visuals of many pro heroes, telling him to choose whatever quirk and hero most interested him, and to let that take his form. Number 6 chose O'Clock, who All For One complimented him on, telling him to visualize him as his mentor, and that he is the form he's meant to take. Likewise, All For One also went to Sokoto Peak and rescued the burnt remains of Toya Todoroki, seeking to use him as a number 1 of their many spare vessels. Due to the deteriorating state of Toya's body, All For One made all the missing pieces replaced with regenerative tissue. 3 years after rescuing him, Toya had awakened in one of their nurseries while they watch over their spare vessels. They informed Toya that the process of rebuilding his body was a failure, unable to fully make use of his quirk, but they still intended to raise him like the others. However, Toya bluntly refused to be trained by anyone other than his father and managed to escape. All For One and the doctor let him go, unable to control him due to his obsession with his father and believing he would die within a month's time due to his fractured body. The Underground Masquerade. A few years later, in the city of Osaka, All For One organized an illegal fighting event known as the Underground Masquerade. The event helped him move illegal drugs, test different variants of quirk-boosting drugs, and search for interesting quirks worth stealing. His activities attracted the attention of the pro-hero O'Clock, who infiltrated the tournament by posing as a fighter, obtaining evidence of drug trafficking. It also attracted a young Rumi Usagiyama, although she was more interested in fighting, defeating everyone who dared to face her. All For One, who had been watching the fights from the security room, decided to harvest some quirks. He released a gas that empowers the quirks, making those who breathe it go on a rampage. To prevent anyone from fleeing, All For One deployed his subordinates, including a hooded man, and with the help of Kurogiri and his warp gate, he steals those quirks that interest him. All For One was especially eager to get a hold of O'Clock's quirk, Overclock, to give to number 6. The hero allied with Rumi and Kendo Rappa, one of the underground fighters, to escape from there. Their escape was interrupted by the hooded man, leading to a battle. All For One was annoyed at being unable to see a clear view of the battle due to most of the security cameras being destroyed, as well as the panicking spectators getting in the way. He contemplates cleaning the arena himself, but Kurogiri disagrees as he believes any further escalation might summon All Might to the place, further irritating All For One. He decides to let the situation settle on its own. When realizing that the hooded man was too difficult a foe to defeat by his own means, O'Clock put in motion an emergency plan, which consisted of Rumi escaping and warning his allies outside to request the assistance of All Might. The plan worked, and All Might immediately left his hero office to help out in Osaka. Kurogiri informed All For One that All Might is on the way and they should retreat as to not lose their valuable test subjects, as well as O'Clock, but All For One, annoyed that he couldn't watch the fight between O'Clock and the hooded man, instead requested Kurogiri to assist him in buying some time. After explaining the dichotomy between heroes and villains, All For One places his hand on several of the unconscious individuals, utilizing his quirk on each of them to boost their powers, transforming them into violent villains who rampaged the city streets. All For One was satisfied with the results because even All Might would waste time protecting everyone and re-establishing order, but Kurogiri tells him that he's gone too far with this action because the incident would serve as a clue that leads back to them. All For One didn't care about it, arguing that it was a risk well worth it to get the Overclock quirk. All Might shows up and defeats the villains in the blink of an eye. Kurogiri relents that All Might's actions barely bought them any time, but All For One gleefully responds that it bought them 3 seconds, more than enough time to be able to get Overclock. However, the unexpected intervention of Rumi, who returned to help fight the hooded man, spoiled the plan, which left him frustrated and displeased. With All Might closing in, Kurogiri uses his quirk to quickly retrieve the hooded man. Once in the hideout, Hood rampages about, yelling that he can still fight when he's stopped and restrained by All For One. He expressed his disappointment in him as his strength, agility, and regeneration had greatly weakened in just a few minutes of battle, initially believing his martial arts skills would have got the job done, but that his commitment to brawling messes with his new shape-shifting ability. Using his quirk to shut him down, All For One tells Kurogiri to transport him to the doctor for further modifications. Despite the failure, All For One keeps calm and reflects that he can be patient since every step leads him closer to All Might, though still states that getting his hands on Overclock would have furthered the cause, saying that it will be his eventually and he already knows how he'll put it to use. The fall of All For One. All Might eventually fought and critically injured All For One, but he similarly received a debilitating wound in the process. Incapacitated by his defeat, All For One went into hiding as he attempted to heal from his injuries, having Gigantomachia and Kyudai track down useful quirks to help him recover. During this period of time, Kyudai began work at creating a hyper-regeneration quirk, which he believed would be of use to help his condition. However, with the knowledge that due to most of his wounds having been cauterized, it would have little effect on him currently. My Hero Academia Vigilantes. At some point, shortly after being injured, the hero O'Clock infiltrated one of his lairs, coming face to face with the villain who snatched his quirk Overclock and wounded his face, leaving a distinctive scar. He would then give Overclock to number 6 and let his transformation process begin. During this period of time, All For One began to conduct various experiments towards the general public, all for the goal of creating a being that can rival All Might in power. Just like with the Underground Masquerade, he primarily made use of the trigger drug, using number 6 and the parasitic Queen Bee, Queen Hachisuka, to expose it to the public and examine their out-of-control quirks, turning them into instant villains. Those who fascinated them would be kidnapped and forced into bioengineering experimentations and body modifications, transforming them into next-level villains as just another step to test their quirk potentials. All the while, All For One kept a close watch over number 6, under the guise of a mental illusion of his master O'Clock, providing him various advice as some form of conscience. A few years after the failed attack on the Tokyo Sky Egg, number 6 adopts the identity of Rokuro Nomura, becoming the pro-hero known as Rock, and managing to become the new manager of Feather Hats, befriending Kazuho Hanayama. Number 6 decides to take advantage of her when she was going through a bad time due to her feelings towards Koichi. Under the guise of O'Clock, All For One mentors number 6 on how to use his Overclock quirk to interpret Kazuho's subconscious reactions to say the answers and words that Kazuho wants to hear. Thanks to this, he manages to trick her into following him into an abandoned building and making her the Queen Bee's new host. With Kazuho turned into Bee-Pop, All For One observes number 6 carry out his plan to sacrifice her in order to kill Koichi, all as a part of his heroic origin story as the pro-hero O'Clock 2, but the plan fails. Koichi manages to rescue Kazuho, being taken to a hospital where the Queen Bee is extracted from inside her and number 6 ends up seriously injured. Filled with hatred, the villain swears to Koichi that he will take revenge by killing him and Kazuho. As the first step of his plan, number 6 infiltrates the police department, disposing of Aizo Tanuma and the information he had collected, connecting All For One to the current events in Naruhara. O'Clock congratulates him on his approach, striking first to erase every trace of the past, so that powers that be will be unable to make a move. Number 6 then proceeds to start his revenge scheme, known as Operation Anonymous. Taking advantage of the heroes, police, and vigilantes fighting with each other, number 6 sends his anonymous drones throughout the city to execute the plan, with O'Clock reminding him that teamwork is key, to prevent your enemies from teaming up and to ensure that your side are all on the same page. After disabling communications in the city, number 6 sends the Anonymous throughout Naruhara to disrupt the heroes and civilians, causing enough trouble to create a sense of unease, but not too much to call upon upper-level heroes like All Might. He uses the distraction to storm Kazuho's hospital, with O'Clock admiring his smart thinking at leaving the Anonymous outside of the building so as to not distract from his use of Overclock or letting them inadvertently explode inside. However, he is further distracted by the combined force of Sogo Kugisaki with a submachine gun and Koichi Himawari's repulsion blasts. O'Clock notes how with the blasts being sprayed around, they aren't intending to seriously injure him, just force him to overuse his quirk and run out of oxygen. Number 6 is temporarily restrained by the police, but he uses his transformative abilities to slip out of the cuffs. O'Clock warns him about watching out for Soga, and then once Koichi starts blasting at him with rapid spots, O'Clock points out how annoying they are to deal with, so recommends retreating so he doesn't run out of breath, which number 6 reluctantly does. Reconvening outside, number 6 spots Koichi blasting off into the sky, causing O'Clock to realize that he's leaving to summon All Might, warning him that they'll only have about 60 seconds until he arrives. Despite this, O'Clock is confident in number 6's abilities, since this time he can easily sneak into the hospital, eliminate Kazuho, and escape, embracing his anonymity. Number 6, however, disagrees with this notion, as doing so would only leave him as nameless and faceless as ever, and decides to indulge himself and massacre everyone, just as Koichi returns behind him. After talking between each other, the two begin to fight, with number 6 catching Koichi off guard and seemingly destroying him with a knuckle bomb punch. However, to his surprise, Koichi emerges from the explosion relatively fine, with O'Clock reminding number 6 that there must be an unknown factor at play, and to observe in detail rather than using back in to attack. They realize that Koichi has been using his slide and glide quirk to repel the explosions. And recognizing his speed, maneuverability, and flight, O'Clock suggests a hasty retreat. Number 6 irritatingly refuses this warning and begins to give chase with the Vigilante. As Koichi continues to dodge each of number 6's attacks, O'Clock surmises that he might have managed to lure number 6 away from the hospital and still intends on seeking All Might's help, with number 6 taking the bait, something he's painfully aware of already. Number 6 confronts Koichi about how he's able to match his every movement, which he's unable to properly answer, causing O'Clock to note how he isn't playing dumb, meaning that he must be handling the overclock attack subconsciously. Equating Koichi's luckiness to button mashing, number 6 decides to go in for a rush attack, blasting Koichi with a flurry of punches which he attempts to reflect. O'Clock informs him that his quantity over quality tactic is ill-advised, as the essence of overclock is acceleration of one's thought process, which allows them to deliberately choose the optimal action every time, but without strength akin to All Might, a head-on approach won't be effective. Number 6 ignores this advice and continues the assault, but Koichi is able to block and deflect every single attack. Bewildered by how he's managed to match overclock's speed, O'Clock figures out what's going on. He talks about how the human body will often take action without waiting for a conscious decision to be made, and that Koichi's subconscious action follows this line of thought. He continues that while number 6's brain can process thoughts faster than everyone, Koichi's body can act even faster than his thoughts. O'Clock suggests number 6 abandon the mission and retreat, while also stressing not to encounter Koichi again. He states that with his superior quirk, which grants him high-speed movement, ranged attacks, and defensive force fields, as well as the subconscious reflexes to trigger them all when needed, while he may only be able to flee and dodge currently, in the days to come if he perfects his abilities, he will become the perfect foil, a foe like All Might to be avoided. Number 6, however, angrily rejects this statement, declaring executing Koichi to now be the only thing that matters to him, transforming into a giant spider-like creature known as the High Crawler. Thanks to the modifications in his body, the High Crawler form allows number 6 to utilize overclock indefinitely, allowing him to finally take the opportunity to overwhelm Koichi. Despite this, O'Clock advises him against his tactics, as thanks to Koichi's years as a vigilante, unlike most pros, he's always been on the defensive side, meaning that he's developed a fight or flight response to a fight, a variant fighter trained to counter any attack. O'Clock tells him he's too focused on mimicking O'Clock's fighting style and needs to come up with another plan to catch Koichi off guard. Their plan is to distract Koichi for long enough to be harassed by the mob of remaining anonymous, using his control with overclock to overwhelm him on all sides. All for One then starts to think to himself that changing targets has come at a considerable cost, and while he considers the mission a failure, the experiment has taken an intriguing turn, gleefully telling number 6 to follow his twisted path, seek his culmination, and surpass every limit. He attempts to snipe at Koichi from afar, but is attacked by Knuckle Duster, the real O'Clock, and through their skirmish, Koichi ends up blasting him and number 6 in the sky before the villain once again changes tactics. Combusting the bomber cells within his body into plasma energy, number 6 transforms into his lightning-style form, granting him the power of flight. Finally shedding his O'Clock disguise, All for One is surprised by number 6's action, praising how his admiration for heroes has set him on this path, and his rage has allowed him to maximize his potential, no longer operating to his whims, but taking flight on his own free will, the greatest guinea pig he can ask for. With how much the fight has escalated, All for One criticizes number 6 for how bombastic it's gotten, calling Operation Anonymous a total failure, and telling him to move on to the retrieval phase. However, number 6 disagrees, as all he wants and needs to do is to kill Koichi with all the strength he can muster, his sole desire left. All for One gleefully lets number 6 show him how brightly his existence can burn. All for One gleefully watches on as number 6 proceeds to fuse together himself and all the remaining bomber cells of the Anonymous, witnessing his final shining act, the powerful incarnation he's long desired. Transforming into the form known as Destruction Style, All for One looks on at the portrait of hell as he witnesses the Anonymous and their bomber cells combusting, transferring all their power to number 6, as All for One asks if this is his concept of a true hero. Transformed into a gigantic flaming humanoid, Number 6 violently attacks Koichi, managing to seriously injure him, forcing the young vigilante to escape. After Koichi escapes into a building to hide from the now giant Number 6, All For One reminds him that his target is a master of hide and seek, and he'll be trickier to hit underneath the building, asking what his next move is. Seeing his decision to destroy the building into nothing, All For One gleefully states that he's reached the conclusion just like his old chum, smashing everything to dust with overwhelming violence. All For One gleefully watches as an enraged Number 6 endlessly bangs on the rubble of the building Koichi was hiding in, all to ensure that he was dead. When there was a sudden explosion and Koichi emerges from the debris, apparently without too many major wounds, and ready to face Number 6 one more time. As soon as he sees that he's still alive, Number 6 attacks Koichi, who dodges his blows until he can finally fight back with a new technique he's developed, knuckle style, piercing Number 6's body. The villain regenerates his wound, but Koichi continues to use his new technique to constantly attack him, ripping his body apart each time. Although Number 6 regenerates or reattaches the missing parts, Koichi keeps the villain at bay until help can arrive. Seeing such skill, All For One begins to observe Koichi, examining how his slide and glide quirk is a simple one with force fields that can repulse or absorb in some way, remarking on his relative mastery of the quirk, while also noting that the quirk itself is the height of mediocrity. He notes that the occasional high output bursts are fleeting and that he runs out of steam shortly afterward, and that it's simply just polished use of a quirk that lacks any decisive power. At least that's what he thought. Noticing the extremely powerful punches Koichi has started to execute with his quirk, All For One reflects on how it is far more than should be possible, likely drawing from a source of passion that he's imbuing his fists with. He thinks about how his quirk has begun to reveal its true potential, wondering if he was disguising it as a weak quirk the whole time, or if his trial had triggered explosive growth, asking him what drives him and what obsession spurred him to evolve. Number 6 seemingly manages to put an end to Koichi, with All For One congratulating him, while lamenting no body means no sample to retrieve. Despite that, he considers it as a whole to be a worthwhile experiment, discovering Koichi's latent potential even though it couldn't best Number 6's tenacity. He congratulates him on his victory, and even though he'll soon lose control of the combustion process and burn away to nothing, he's shone a glorious light on his future. However, they're both further shocked to discover Koichi still alive and kicking, and their battle resumes. All For One observes their fighting, calling it akin to frolicking within their exchange of passionate blows. He wonders where all their energy is coming from and what their quirks are tapping into, as it's nothing he can comprehend. He's desperate to know how to reach this domain beyond the singularity when he hears Knuckle Duster behind him, telling him that a collector such as him would never understand. All For One turns around to see who spoke to him, but doesn't see anyone. Despite one last-ditch attempt to finish everything off by exploding into several mini-bombers, Number 6 is done in by the arrival of all the pro-heroes, specifically All Might and Endeavor. Despite this, his main body is able to escape, with All For One confronting the skeletal remains. He notes another crisis has been averted by All Might's meddling, but still commends Number 6's creativity. How even he was able to outmaneuver All Might at the last minute, stating now that no one can stop him and the world is his oyster. Number 6 slowly begins to rebuild his body, stumbling between the crowds of civilians using his overclock speed to keep him out of sight. All the while, All For One reflects on his current burnt up display, stating that without enough bomber cells, his combustion ended before completion, but still should be capable of achieving his final goal. He reminds Number 6 that his specialty lies with Operation Anonymous, and with the heroes believing to have defeated the threat, he is once again the Invisible Man, and able to finish the crawler with no one the wiser. They manage to locate Koichi on a nearby rooftop, with All For One telling him to do one quick strike to kill him, also telling him to collect the body for him to study. He gleefully states to kill Koichi for him, but instead Number 6 ignores his request, transforming into his Rokuro Nomura face to speak with Koichi, brushing away All For One's visage. After their conversation, Number 6 scratches Koichi as a way of leaving his mark on the world before he leaves it, exploding in one final detonation. Due to these events, All For One decides to do some research on Koichi's history, but finds nothing extraordinary about him. He's just an utterly average guy, born from ordinary parents and with a monotonous upbringing, and yet he managed to capitalize on a powerful quirk and abnormal battle prowess. The idea that circumstance, experience, and sheer force of will could turn a man into a Superman invalidates his methodology behind Operation Anonymous. Coming to this conclusion, All For One wonders how he will be able to respond when civilians start taking heroic action. If extraordinary potential is available to everyone, it may be a path to chaos, but it also introduces uncertainty into his machinations. Despite this, All For One tells Kyudai and Kurogiri that they have to pour their efforts into their next plan. Should society reach the point where heroes can appear from anywhere, he'll command an entity that can face any hero head-on through its own individual might. In a status tube, he looks upon their bioengineered Nomu, saying that he was led to this culmination by Number 6 himself. All for One continued to groom Tomura as his successor, well aware that Tomura really was the grandson of Nana Shimura, and wanted to use this to his advantage. He also assigned Kurogiri with serving and overseeing Tomura's development, warning Kurogiri to use Gigantomachia once he believes he's no longer capable of ensuring Tomura's safety. Sometime prior to the start of the school year, he created the League of Villains, an organization for Tomura to run and enlist villains to aid in his cause, all while acting as a front for his true goals. Shortly before the start of the school year, he learned a rumor that All Might would become a teacher at UA, so he called upon the Aoyamas, informing Yuga to apply there, intending to use him as his mole. U.S.J. Arc. All for One's first command for Yuga was to discover and report when the class and All Might would be isolated together. Thanks to a distraction caused by Tomura, he informed him that All Might would be teaching them while at the unforeseen simulation joint, leading All for One and Kyudai to supply Tomura and Kurogiri with an army of no-name thugs to act as their League of Villains, but also their perfected Nomu, designed to kill All Might once and for all. Unfortunately, their plan fails, and Kurogiri is forced to warp himself and an injured Tomura back to their hideout at the last second, allowing them to escape before being defeated. Tomura berates over his failure, his injuries, and losing all their subordinates, and his Nomu being defeated, and of course All Might surviving. However, All for One, speaking on the monitor, says that nothing went wrong and that he was simply over-optimistic. Tomura mentions one kid in particular who kept getting in his way and had a power similar to All Might, which interests All for One. He says that it's too late to mourn and that they should gather a new group handpicked for efficiency, saying that they should take all the time that they need. All for One tells Tomura that he's a symbol of importance and that next time he will show the world the horror of his existence. UA Sports Festival Arc. A recuperating Tomura watches the UA Sports Festival, including the obstacle race where he sees Izuku take first place. Later on, before the battle between Izuku and Shoto Todoroki begins, All for One tells Tomura to pay close attention to their match as they might become obstacles for him in the future. Tomura responds by telling his master to not make him laugh. Versus Hero Killer Arc. All for One, using his monitor to speak through, orders Kurogiri to allow Stain and Tomura to continue talking, saying that Tomura's meeting with Stain, an experienced infamous villain, will stimulate Tomura's growth. Before he leaves for Hosu, Tomura asks All for One to let him borrow some Nomu because he does not like the hero killer Stain, and that destroying things he does not like seems alright. All for One decides to give Tomura 3 Nomu, hoping that Tomura will make the opportunity a learning experience. In the aftermath of the incident, 2 of the Nomu are killed, 1 is detained, and Stain is captured. The latter surprises All for One, but he's still happy that things are going as he has foreseen. He exclaims that Tomura's position is to supervise and unify the new villains who have come to join the League of Villains. Dr. Garaki expresses doubt that Tomura can do his job and says that if All for One stepped in, things would be proceeding faster. All for One proceeds to ask the doctor to patch him up faster, adding that he will let Tomura do all the hard work so that he may become his successor as he was born to do. All for One tells All Might to rejoice in the transient peace while he still can. My Hero Academia, 2 Heroes. Learning about David Shield's plan to break into I Island during the expo, All for One contacted Wolfram, the villain hired to assist in the scheme, and provided him with an additional muscle augmentation quirk, wanting to have a hand in All Might's former partner's fall to villainy. Forest Training Camp Arc. Thanks to an interaction between Izuku and Tomura, UA decided to change at the last minute the location of the upcoming Quirk training camp, to keep it a secret from potential villain attacks. Despite this, All for One was able to figure it out by commanding Yuga to reveal the location, the information he promptly gave to Tomura to use. Hideout Raid Arc. After the Vanguard Action Squad's successful capture of Katsuki Bakugo and Ragdoll, All for One promptly stole the latter's search quirk. He then had Dr. Garaki once again replicate his quirk, believing that he may be defeated soon, receiving a copy of the All for One quirk for himself, while the original was kept by the doctor, with the intention of passing it down to Tomura when he was ready. After Katsuki attacks Tomura in defiance of joining their cause, Tomura understands that mere words alone won't convince Katsuki to join them, and decides to ask for the force of his teacher to help him convince Katsuki. All for One, who had been watching Tomura on his computer, commends his apprentice for his wise decision. The League of Villains is soon apprehended by pro-heroes and the police force. All for One decides to take action himself, emerging at the Nomu manufacturing warehouse, and apologizes to Tiger, explaining that Ragdoll is in a comatose state because he stole her quirk, Search, which he found to be quite useful. Best Genus restrains All for One with his quirk and orders his fellow pro-heroes not to let the villain do anything. Before the pros can act, the entire warehouse is completely destroyed and the surrounding area suffers extensive damage as well. All for One had unleashed a blast wave that had seemingly killed the pro heroes and destroyed the warehouse. All for One is livid with the heroes for interfering with his apprentice, who has started thinking for himself as well as leading others by himself and hopes that they no longer bother him. All for One decides to quickly resolve the mess created by the heroes. All for One uses a warping quirk to produce a black liquid at the League of Villains hideout. The black liquid summons dozens of Nomu inside and outside of the hideout, forcing the pro heroes and police force to confront the legions of Nomu. This black liquid also teleports the League of Villains and Katsuki away. All for One discovers the pro heroes have survived his attack. All for One claps and praises Best Jeanist for using his quirk to pull his fellow heroes out of the way in order to reduce the blast's impact on them. Despite his heavy injuries, Best Jeanist attempts to fight back and begins sending fiber strings. However, All for One impales Best Jeanist from afar. The mighty villain mentions that he does not need his quirk because it does not suit Tomura's personality. Tomura, Kurogiri, and the Vanguard Action Squad and Katsuki all materialize from the black liquid in front of All for One. The villain sees that his apprentice has failed again. However, All for One is neither angry nor disappointed and encourages him to try again since he still has the Vanguard Action Squad and Katsuki, whom he deemed important. All for One implores Tomura to continue trying as many times as he likes since everything is for his sake. Suddenly, All Might appears above him and attacks. However, All for One blocks the attack as All Might declares that he will take everything back, while All for One wonders if All Might will attempt to kill him again. All Might and All for One clash, which creates a shockwave that sends Katsuki, Tomura, and the Vanguard Action Squad backwards. Both All for One and All Might criticize each other for becoming weaker. All Might declares that he will save Katsuki and will not repeat the same mistake as he did 6 years ago, and this time he will definitely put All for One behind bars along with the League of Villains. All Might charges at his arch-nemesis, but All for One sends another huge blast wave at All Might, causing the symbol of peace to be sent flying away with great force. All for One's blast wave attack not only hits All Might, but destroys several buildings in the process. Katsuki becomes concerned, but All for One tells Katsuki not to fret since his blast wave attack is not strong enough to kill All Might. All for One orders Tomura to escape along with Katsuki and comments that his black liquid warping quirk would not be able to help Tomura and the League of Villains escape. All for One uses a quirk that forcefully activates Kurogiri's warp gate, which causes a portal to open. All for One orders the League of Villains to escape into Kurogiri's portal. Suddenly, All Might reappears on the battlefield, refusing to allow the arch-villain to escape and charges at him. Before heading into battle, All for One tells Tomura that he can still grow stronger. All Might and All for One clash once again, while Katsuki tries to fend off some of the Vanguard Action Squad trying to apprehend him. All Might attempts to help Katsuki only for All for One to intervene and stop him. Suddenly, Izuku, Eijiro Kirishima, and Tenya Ida appear above them in the air. All for One sees the trio and attempts to attack them, but All Might intervenes by punching him. Katsuki manages to use this opportunity to escape alongside Izuku and his friends. Now that the tables have turned, All for One sees that they no longer can secure victory due to Katsuki's rescue, and that most of the Vanguard Action Squad is unconscious. All for One decides to save Tomura and the Vanguard Action Squad, forcefully activating Magna's magnetism quirk. Before Tomura can stop, he and the Vanguard Action Squad are magnetically pulled into Kurogiri's warp gate. As he's being sucked into the warp gate, Tomura calls out to his teacher concerned for his safety. Before Tomura teleports away, All for One tells Tomura to continue the fight. Tomura and the unconscious Kurogiri are teleported away by the warp gate, causing the portal to disperse. All Might charges at All for One, but All for One uses his warping quirk to teleport Gran Torino in front of him, using the elderly hero as a human shield, which causes Gran Torino to take All Might's attack. All for One expresses his hatred for All Might as he is the one who brought down his comrades in the past, and while he descended into darkness, All Might rose to the top as the symbol of peace. All for One prepares to fire his blast wave move, intending to blow away Gran Torino and All Might at the same time. However, All Might pulls Gran Torino away and uses a Detroit Smash to cancel out All for One's blast wave move. All for One sees that the destruction of the city has brought chaos and decides to put the innocent civilians in danger so that All Might will not be able to fight at full strength. Furious with All for One's sadism, All Might grabs his arm while throwing Gran Torino away for safety. All Might admonishes All for One for all the despicable crimes he has committed and for his misanthropy. All Might punches All for One in the face, shattering his mask. However, All Might's punch was not strong enough to finish him off. As Gran Torino calls out to him, All Might's face reverts to his true form, reaching his limits. All for One says that All Might would not be the first to criticize him, as he's heard all those same lines before from the previous One For All successor, Nana Shimura. All Might is angry at the arch-villain for mentioning her name, as All for One notes that Nana was all bark and no bite, only going on about her ideals and was not even strong. He mocks her for her uselessness and mentions that she died in an embarrassing, shameful way. Infuriated, All Might prepares to attack All For One, but he proceeds to use his Blast Wave technique against All Might, causing the hero to be blasted into the air. Gran Torino catches All Might and lands him to safety on the ground. All For One decides to finish his apprentice's hard work and sever the trust in heroes once and for all. He once again expresses his hatred for All Might due to taking something away from him and wants him to die in the most gruesome way possible. He fires another Blast Wave attack at All Might, who, seeing that an innocent civilian is trapped under rubble behind him, blocks All For One's attack and saves the civilian from being harmed. However, All Might expends the last of his power and reverts to his true form. All For One relishes in the fact that All Might's true form has been exposed for all to see. Everyone in the country sees All Might's true form and begins panicking. All For One mocks All Might for the pitiful state he's in. However, All Might does not care about his rotting body nor his exposure to the world and declares that his spirit burns strongly, which is what truly matters. Wanting to break his spirit even more, All For One reveals that Tomura is Nana's grandson. All Might is completely shocked by this information and refuses to believe it, but All For One tells him that it's all the truth. All For One wonders why All Might is not smiling and sarcastically remarks about All Might's smile, which is something Nana would always do. All Might's spirit is greatly demoralized by the mockery, while All For One continues relishing in All Might's pitiful state. Invigorated by the civilians, All Might activates One For All throughout the right side of his body, transforming it into his hero form. All Might smiles and states that heroes have many things to protect, which is why they do not lose. All For One deduces that All Might will unleash his final attack, commenting that wounded heroes are the most terrifying of all. All For One's comment causes him to reminisce about their last battle where All Might delivered the final blow to him, and admits that the look on All Might's face during the last attack has still haunted him to this very day. All For One prepares to fire his Blast Wave attack, when suddenly flames strike at the mighty villain, which All For One uses another Blast Wave attack to swat away. All For One is surprised by the appearance of Endeavor and Edgeshot, specifically how they were able to make haste with the Nomu much faster than he expected, and that he shouldn't have taken Endeavor's number 2 rank so lightly. Annoyed with the pro-hero's interference, All For One prepares his Blast Wave attack again. However, Edgeshot uses his quirk and great speed to attack, but All For One dodges the attack. Growing impatient with all the sentimental talk, All For One blasts Endeavor and Edgeshot back, and activates a number of his strongest quirks in his right arm, causing it to become an enlarged, mutated arm filled with numerous deadly screws and hardened minerals. All For One charges at All Might with his heavily empowered and mutated arm. While heading towards All Might, All For One knows from battling him that All Might no longer has One For All, and that he's simply fighting with the remaining embers that have yet to be extinguished. He further tells All Might that he knows to whom he gave All For One to, Izuku Midoriya, having deduced it from Tomura's report about the boy. All For One taunts All Might by saying that he has also failed as a teacher towards Izuku due to his apprentice's recklessness and prepares to kill him. Both All For One and All Might clash by punching each other with their enhanced fists, which creates a huge shockwave that devastates a great portion of the city. As they struggle, All For One uses his Impact Recoil quirk to revert all the damage to All Might. However, All Might transfers All For One to his other arm, sacrificing his right arm but renders Impact Recoil ineffective. All Might says that he must indeed criticize Izuku for his actions, while All For One is shocked that All Might would go to such lengths to protect the leftovers of All For One and admits that he miscalculated. All Might refuses to die until he's finished bringing up Izuku, and then counters by throwing his empowered left arm and punches All For One, who has left his guard open. The punch, however, was meant to lower All For One's guard, and All Might transfers One For All to his right arm and prepares for his final attack, United States of Smash, which creates a great shockwave when it hits All For One, destroying half the city. After the dust clears, All For One is in a crater, badly beaten and unconscious. Later, Endeavor and All Might watch All For One being placed in the Iron Maiden. The next day, All For One is incarcerated into Tartarus, a special prison for criminals whom the death penalty is not enough. All For One, in a wheelchair and on life support, wonders where he is, much to the prison guard's annoyance, who's pushing him to his holding cell. The prison guard tells him his location. All For One apologizes, causing the prison guard to assume that he's blind. All For One reveals that for the past 6 years he's been using an infrared quirk to sense his surroundings as a way to compensate for his blindness, but due to all the sensors he's unable to sense anything and apologizes to the prison guard. The prison guard is flabbergasted that All For One fought All Might in such a condition. While being pushed into his holding cell, All For One is not angry or upset for losing against All Might. Instead, All For One is happy because his defeat at All Might's hand will grow Tomura's hatred for All Might, as well as his regret for being unable to save his master, which will motivate him to gain experience and become much stronger. All For One smiles, knowing that even though he lost the battle, he will still succeed at being the better teacher than All Might, and that his successor will come out on top. Provisional Hero License Exam Arc. During the Provisional Hero License Exam, All For One receives a visit from All Might. All For One comments on the severe strictness of the prison he's being held in, that even if he were to try and activate a quirk, he'd be put down instantly. All Might assures All For One that he will never escape, nor is he getting out anytime soon from this prison of hell. Moving along, All For One questions again what All Might wants. The former hero wants to know the whereabouts of Tomura, which the villain answers that he doesn't know, and unlike him, he's already let Tomura carry on. All Might proceeds to question him about his motives, but the villain claims All Might is never going to be satisfied by his answers. All For One makes his answers simple. Both he and All Might are the same. All For One wishes to be the king of evil in the same way that All Might wants to be the symbol of peace. All Might asks if All For One wanted to live forever being utterly evil, then why does he need a successor? All For One finds All Might's question funny, answering that All Might took everything away from him, leaving him in a regrettable state to the point that he needs complex devices to survive. Because of this, his influence and ideals had become limited thanks to him, so he's been grooming Tomura to become his successor and carry on his legacy. Security informs All Might that he has 3 minutes left, much to All For One's disappointment as he still had much more to say. Due to All Might's retirement, the villain asks about the state of the outside world, but the security inform All Might that he cannot tell him any information of what's going on outside. All For One decides to make a hypothesis then. With All Might's retirement, Endeavor has become the new #1 hero. However, it does not seem that it will be enough to contain the anxiety and concern of society, and sensing the growing insecurity in the world, the villains will rise up, believing it to be their chance to change society. In this situation, Tomura and his allies will grow in power and influence to reach the top, although they will have to clash with other organizations that intend on doing the same, clashes in which All Might will be unable to do anything. All For One mockingly asks All Might how it feels to be absolutely powerless. His words make All Might angry, who replies to All For One not to presume everything. All Might understands that he chose Tomura as his successor because he was the grandson of his master Nana, but he will not allow All For One's twisted vision to be realized, and he won't let himself be killed by Tomura. All For One wonders if All Might came here to tell him that. As he leaves, All Might tells All For One he will smash his plans as many times as it takes, and he will pass the rest of his life in prison. As the prison cell begins closing, All For One chuckles at All Might's final statement. Pro-Hero Arc. All For One claims he's willing to restore Ragdoll's quirk, but it would require activating his own quirk to do so. The authorities determine the safest approach is to not let him do anything while investigating the number of quirks he has stockpiled. A few days later, Izuku experiences the vestiges of One For All, where he views a flashback between All For One and Yoichi, the first user of One For All. He witnesses All For One transfer the stockpiling quirk to his brother, out of kindness as well as to force him to submit. All For One claims that he was creating a reality just like the one in the comics the brothers used to read as kids. He also tells his brother that by acquiring a quirk, he would start seeing the reality as it is. Joint Training Arc. In Tartarus, one of the prison guards grows anxious regarding All For One's presence, wondering when his sentence will be finalized, with the other one stating that it's been delayed due to the unknown factors like Gigantomachia and the League still being at large, and not wanting to make All For One into a martyr for the villains. All For One suddenly begins to speak, shocking the guards, and apologizes for setting off the alarms due to feeling uneasy due to having started to reminisce about things from the past, claiming to hear his younger brother's voice. Paranormal Liberation War Arc. While investigating and analyzing Kurogiri, who they had captured several months ago, Naomasa Tsukauchi and Gran Torino find out that he is a Nomu created from the corpse of Oboro Shirakumo. When they question All For One about his methods to create the Nomu, the villain simply responds with a metaphor in which he compares the creation of the Nomu as producing wine, trampling grapes, people, to extract the juice, quirks, and letting them ferment into wine, Nomu. Later, Naomasa and Gran Torino ask Shota Aizawa and Hisashi Yamada to help awaken Oboro's consciousness. Although it was an emotionally painful process, they succeed and obtain vital information. This, along with other data obtained by Hawks, allows the heroes to locate Tomura, who is at the Jaku General Hospital, undergoing a complex and extensive operation at the hands of Kyudai Garaki to obtain more power, transplanting the original All For One quirk to him. as well as the other bases of the Paranormal Liberation Front, a formation between the League of Villains and the Meta Liberation Army. Not without great difficulty, the heroes manage to reach the secret laboratory under the hospital and prevent Kyudai from awakening Tomura prematurely, destroying the machine that kept him alive, even with Kyudai believing that his master's dream had ended due to Tomura appearing to be dead. While Tomura is in the state of apparent death, he enters a dream world where he sees and interacts with representations of his relatives, until a shadowy vestige of All For One arrives, telling him to come to him. Tomura's family reappears to stop him, even his grandmother Nana, yet despite their pleas to not fall to darkness, Tomura rejects them and embraces his master. Tomura unexpectedly awakens, and immediately uses his empowered decay to destroy the hospital, killing dozens of heroes in the process and even destroying much of the nearby city. After this, he orders Gigantomachia to come to him, bringing the members of the League with him, but also begins to hear a voice inside his head that orders him to go and get the One For All quirk. Tomura is confused by this, but soon ignores it as he begins to be attacked by Endeavor and other heroes. Even so, the voice inside him insists again, and compelled by it, Tomura uses his search quirk to locate One For All, discovering it in possession of Izuku heading towards him. Tomura manages to reach Izuku, starting a bloody battle between him and Izuku, Katsuki, Endeavor, Shota Aizawa, Gran Torino, and several other heroes. To prevent more heroes from interfering, Tomura summons a group of Nomu to confront the reinforcements. While all this is happening, All For One is seen smiling within his cell. While facing Izuku, Tomura ends up calling him little brother, a statement that leaves both of them confused. This allows Tomura to realize that the mysterious inner voice comes from the ego of his master that exists within All For One, who tries to take over his will. Tomura thanks his master for raising him from the bottom of his heart, but also refuses to be controlled by him, as he wants to be greater than All For One was and breaks free from his image in his mind. However, the heroes begin to get the upper hand in the battle, and when Tomura is burned alive by Endeavor's Prominence burn attack, All For One's vestige reaches out his hand and suggests Tomura hand his body over to him. He appears to do so, as suddenly a completely entombed Tomura attacks Endeavor, stabbing him with his rivet stab quirk that emerges from his back. The wounded Endeavor wonders how he can stay alive before he starts falling to the ground. Tomura then turns his attention back to Izuku, calling him little brother, and attacks him with the rivet stab. Katsuki pushes Izuku out of the way and gets impaled by the tendrils instead. Tomura attempts to wrestle back control over his body, while All For One comments that of all the bloodshed in the battle, Katsuki's was the most pointless. This causes Izuku to snap and attacks Tomura directly, blinded by rage. Tomura himself is shocked by this, but All For One's vestige within him is delighted, and manages to take control of Tomura's body again. Izuku was so enraged that he was careless, so Tomura is able to grab a hold of him and uses All For One to try and steal One For All. Instead, Izuku ends up within a vestige world where he sees All For One fuse with Tomura, where Tomura demands All For One not to interfere, but All For One sneers that if it weren't for his intervention, Tomura would be dead. Suddenly, Nana Shimura appears alongside Izuku, pestered to see All For One again, as the villain introduces her to Tomura, mockingly exclaiming how his dead grandmother has joined them. He begins to explain the reason for the presence of the vestiges, both from the previous users of All For One and from the original owners of the quirks stolen by All For One. He goes on to tell them of how when he stole quirks, he could hear voices, which caused him to feel some semblance of guilt. However, once he relinquished the quirk, the voices would go away. It wasn't until he met Dr. Garaki that he realized it was the vestiges of the previous owners he had heard, similar to how organs and cells contain a person's DNA. All For One admits he thought that he was the only person who could do this, and realizes when his quirk merged with his younger brother's, it granted him and anyone else who had One For All the ability as well. Then, after finishing his speech, All For One suggests both Nana and Tomura to greet each other. Nana recognizes Tomura as Kotaro's son, but Tomura simply retorts that none of it matters since he hates her too, and begins eroding the vestige world, forcing Nana to protect Izuku. All For One gleefully states that Tomura's rage is overwhelming One For All's will, noticing that this also includes Tomura's hatred for All For One himself, which he's pleased for as it makes him worthy of being the symbol of chaos. Just then, Yoichi appears and helps Nana to push back Tomura's anger. He asks his brother if Tomura is just the next person he's manipulating, while All For One says he wishes that he had made his brother his, but that Yoichi refuses to join him. All For One forces Tomura to combine their powers together to take One For All, stating that Izuku is unworthy since he couldn't protect his friends or teacher. Yoichi says they deem Izuku worthy, and All For One will never understand why, as he and Nana counter All For One and Tomura, causing Izuku and Tomura to separate and regain consciousness. All For One tells Tomura that they failed and they must retreat to let his body reach 100%, but Tomura refuses and decides to stay and fight against All For One's insistence. All for One takes note of Gigantomachia's arrival and states that he came just in the nick of time before Tomura falls unconscious. Spinner, who is tending to Tomura, remembers what his leader had said before about the hands of his deceased family bringing him a sickening rage and puts one of those hands onto Tomura's face. This allows Tomura to reawaken, though All for One is now in full control. He remarks on how his successor found himself some truly great allies, and that the hatred in Tomura's heart serves as a power that gives the vestige of All for One an even greater hold over Tomura's body. All for One uses his radio waves to order the near high-end Nomu to take Tomura's body and retreat. When Spinner reminds All for One of their allies still fighting, the villain coldly states that since Tomura lost, it's only fair that he pays for that loss and subsequently abandons the remaining members. Izuku attempts to stop All for One, but the villain easily blasts him away with an air cannon and tells the hero that they will meet once again once Tomura's body is perfected. The vestige of All for One retreats with the remaining 10 near high-end Nomu, accompanied by Spinner and a compressed Dabi and Skeptic. The surviving heroes try to stop them, but All for One dispatches 3 of the Nomus to confront them. The near high-end's distraction tactics ensured that he, his allies, and several others escaped, while those 3 were destroyed. A few hours later, in Tartarus, the real All for One is able to sense the condition of Tomura's body, noting that while his expectations were slightly off, it wouldn't be much longer. In the forest, the vestige of All for One remarks that the heroes won't get a tomorrow or the chance to get a moment's rest, since it's his turn to lead, ordering the near high ends to invade Tartarus to free his real body. All for One in Tomura's body alongside the near high ends start to invade Tartarus. They destroy the bronze gate as the bridge is lowered, halting them from entering. The near high ends deal with the defending drones, while All for One flies over on a flying Nomu. Tomura starts to wake up, leading to an argument between the two of them over control of the body. All for One reminds him he's doing everything for his sake because Tomura will become the next me. As All for One struggles to break through due to the immense amount of security in Tartarus and Tomura's increasingly failing body, he figures the only way to success is through a coordinated attack inside and out, and that he'll need help from villains. All for One proceeds to hit Tartarus with several radio wave attacks from outside in Tomura's body, shutting down the prison security, followed immediately by another radio waves attack on the inside by himself in his original body, unlocking his and all the other cells on the floor as the previously captured villains quickly disposed of the armed guards. The vestige and original All for One use radio waves to communicate with each other, telling each other their intention to have Tomura's procedure completed within 38 days. The freed, albeit still on life support, All for One then finally reunites with Tomura, in front of the rest of the prisoners, telling them to join him on his path of devastation to become the greatest demon lord. To the majority of the inmates, All for One tells them to be free and cause as much chaos as they want. He then approaches Lady Nagant, telling her it was an honor to meet the treacherous hero, while she reminisces how he was one of her targets back in the day. He requests her to hunt down a specific target, Izuku Midoriya, sure that he will leave UA, and asks her to capture and bring him to him. He also warns her that surely some of the best heroes will be watching over him from a distance, so he recommends that she take her time until they're split up enough, with waiting for a rainy day to be her best bet. Lady Nagant interrupts him by asking why she's the only one with an assignment while the other inmates can just go wild. All for One reminds her how she killed a fellow hero and that she wants the hero society to collapse as well, and as long as Izuku remains, that dream will never come to pass. All for One notices the mentally broken Kaichisaki muttering about his boss and asks if he's a friend of hers. She denies this, but she brings him with her because she believes he will be useful to her in some way despite his mental state, as All for One identifies him as another victim of the Wicked Hero Society. Nevertheless, Lady Nagant agrees to help All for One, and to seal the deal he offers a gift and transfers Airwalk to her. After telling her to deliver the target within 2 months to a mansion in Hibori Woods, he proceeds to give the same task to several other dangerous criminals as well. After escaping from Tartarus, All for One orchestrates another large-scale attack, using both the Nomu and the freed prisoners to attack 6 different prisons to distract the authorities and make it harder for them to track him. All for One is later seen sitting with Tomura and asks Spinner and Dabi to stand guard over him while his body recovers. Spinner asks who Tomura really was, stating All for One wasn't the person he chose to follow. All for One tells Spinner not to worry, saying he has the greatest respect for Tomura's will and that once his body recovers, both of their desires will come to fruition. Dark Hero Arc. After leaving Hibori Woods, All for One seeks refuge in a secret underground cave, one of many safe houses that he and Kyudai left behind as a contingency measure. He's greeted by not only a brand new life support mask to replace his original, but also a drug alongside a pre-recorded message from the doctor. It explains how Tomura got a hold of the Quirk-destroying drug created by the Shie Hasakai, which he immediately attempted to reproduce. After finding out it originated from someone's quirk, he decided rather than focusing on the quirk destroying part, he focused on its original rewind effect during its recreation. He cautions All For One that he can only use it once, but that once he's freed, he's sure it'll help him achieve his dream. He ends the message saying that his voice, eyes, and smile bring joy to his heart, and he wishes his heart be filled with hate. 1 month later, Lady Nagant tracks down Izuku and begins to capture him and execute All For One's orders. In the subsequent duel, Izuku defeats Lady Nagant and requests that she join his cause, only to suddenly have her explode. As it turns out, All For One had been monitoring the battle and anticipating Lady Nagant's possible failure, and had secretly transferred a self-destruct quirk which he had detonated upon sensing her change of heart. He mocks Lady Nagant for being a woeful and pitiful woman, remarking that she was nothing but a tool to achieve ends from everyone, and she should blame her quirk for her tragedy. Expecting Lady Nagant to also reveal the location of the proposed meetup, All For One sets up a trap in the former Creature Rejection Clan hideout, leaving behind a pre-recorded message for Izuku to find. In the message, he taunts Izuku for knowing that someone like him couldn't abandon someone like Lady Nagant, adding in that he didn't force her to join him and that it was her choice. He continues on about how those in society who fall are labeled as villains, and even if one takes pride in their quirk, if you can't fit into the controlled society, you'll be excluded, citing it as human nature. He concludes stating the more Izuku fights, the more his soul will wear down, and reveals that while in prison, he was the one he never stopped thinking about, no longer having any interest in All Might, telling him it's his turn as the mansion explodes. Star and Stripe Arc. After abandoning the Hibori Woods mansion, All For One and the remnants of the League hide out in a secret cave alcove. While sitting on his own makeshift throne, surrounded by the remaining Nomu, All For One talks to Spinner about how thanks to the escaped inmates, the heroes and police have been too busy to put their full focus on them, allowing them to win their game of hide and seek. Spinner asks why he didn't just leave the country, but All For One says evading everyone was just his first goal, and that he has more planned. After Tomura's completion and acquiring One For All For One's next goal is to get his hands on New Order, the quirk of Star and Stripe, the #1 hero of America. He believes that with that power, alongside his own and One For All, he would finally have everything to make the entire world bend to his every whim. However, he's also aware that if Star and Stripe were to collaborate with the Japanese heroes, especially One For All, then it would be trouble for him. So, using his connections to the criminal underworld all over the world, he got them to stir up enough trouble that nations would have to prioritize their own safety, delaying their arrival to Japan. However, he learns that Star and Stripe will be making her way over to the country soon, and while that would be trouble, he also reiterates that if he can get his hands on her quirk, then nothing will be a problem anymore. He then turns to Spinner and tells him that after spending his time guarding him, he will be the one to support Tomura on his crusade, referring to him as the one who spins this tale, reminding him of his status as a heteromorph. All For One then proceeds to send the still slightly incomplete Tomura out to battle and face down Star and Stripe. Meanwhile, within Tomura Shigaraki, a vestige of All For One continues to exert control over him, with the two starting to fuse together into one being. As a result, Tomura now recognizes himself as both Tomura and All For One, with the latter the more dominant personality. Tomura goes after Star and Stripe and her army of fighter jets using a combination of radio waves, air cannon, and heavy payload, releasing an enormous wave of electric energy towards them. Star uses New Order, which can impose a new rule over whatever she touches and names, to remove the air from 100 meters in front of her, forcing Tomura to hold his breath. All while All For One thinks about how it's a horrifying quirk that he really wants. The jets shoot lasers at Tomura from every angle, which he simply uses Reflect and Scatter to shoot back while his body regenerates. Tomura notices the air vacuum has come undone right after Star used a new rule to catch the laser, wondering if that is the limit of New Order. He stretches his body and blasts his way forward towards her, but she simply jumps forward as well, punching him in the face. Star talks about when she was originally saved by All Might as a kid, and that he inspired her to be a hero, something that greatly irritates him as no matter where he goes, it's always all about All Might. Now that she's touched him, Star uses New Order to declare that if Tomura Shigaraki were to even move an inch, his heart would stop. However, Tomura thinks about how she fell for his trap, while All For One continues to push his dominance over Tomura, telling him how thanks to his hatred, the process that should have taken 2 months is now at 97 to 98% in just over 1. He gleefully tells Tomura to let his hatred flow to deliver them to their glorious future, while the resistances permeate to the outside, with Tomura suddenly growing long hair and exploding. Regaining some control, All For One through Tomura deduces exactly how New Order works. He was able to notice some of her limitations, like how while there's no limit to incapacitating someone, it can only power up a body a certain amount. He also figures the rule can't arbitrarily involve things that she hasn't touched. He realizes that the true utility behind the quirk is that it has the most freedom of control with non-living things, as when it comes to naming a living thing, both targets have to have the same sense of understanding. The reason Star's declaration didn't work on him was because Tomura isn't sure of his true identity, whether he's Tomura Shigaraki, All for One, or even Tenko Shimura. However, for inanimate objects with no sense of self, Star's one-sided understanding is enough to enforce the rule. Thinking about all the potential tests for it just makes the quirk even more irresistible to All for One, and wants it even more. After being jostled off the plane he was standing on, Tomura lands back on the flying Nomu, and the two are suddenly blown far away by a giant air visage of Star and Stripe, and proceed to be pinned downward into the ocean with a giant laser sword. Tomura realizes that something big is coming, and that Star is only using the laser sword to stall. So, as the dangerous Tiamat missiles arrive to finally put an end to Tomura, he uses the Nomu to distract the pilots, while he uses Decay to dig underground, avoiding most of the brunt of the missiles and barely surviving. He emerges from the cracked hole, stating to them all that he was only just playing along with their game, and if it was anyone other than him, then they would have been done for. He proceeds to burst his way forward from jet to jet, gloating how me and myself will make better use of her resources. One of the pilots tells Star to try and end them quickly while he's still on top of the jets, but Star is unable to do so, allowing Tomura to jump and grab her face. All for One within Tomura thinks about how he knew facing Star and Stripe with the incomplete body and without One for All was a gamble, but thankfully has finally paid off as he begins to steal New Order while simultaneously decaying Star. The hero uses her quirk to try and halt the decay, but only succeeds in delaying it due to reaching the cap of her strength. Successfully obtaining New Order, All for One calls Star an idiot for trying to protect herself, and thinks back to Yoichi and when they used to read comics, now gaining the quirk, being one step closer to his dream. However, before he can make use of it, the vestiges of Tomura and All for One are faced against a vestige of Star and Stripe, whose presence causes Tomura to internally explode in the real world. As it turns out, Star had used New Order in order to declare that the quirk would revolt against other quirks. A gigantic Star and Stripe begins to pound away at the vestiges, including the one of all the stolen quirks, causing All for One to curse Star's name. All for One, as Tomura, laments to himself that he can only steal or bestow quirks, but not dispose of them, and desperately tries to find someone he can force New Order onto to stop the quirks from rebelling. Instead, the pilots continue to fire at Tomura with their laser barrage, while inside the Star vestige destroys the Reflect quirk. All for One once again angrily curses Star and Stripe as the Spectre of All Might. Tomura takes the Wing quirk from the remains of the Nomu and desperately escapes the battlefield, intending to find someone to pass on New Order to, once again cursing All Might's existence, taking off into the sky. He crashes in on the hideout of prison escapee Kashikokashi, touching his face and planning to take his quirk and make him quirkless, so he can safely transfer New Order without it revolting, allowing him to preserve it. However, as he's about to, the Star and Stripe vestige mocks him, stating that thanks to all the quirks she revolted against, it has resulted in the destruction of the quirk itself. As she starts to fade away, she declares that even though she wasn't able to kill him, as long as people are willing to stand up to save each other, the will of heroism shall be passed on, and will put him to an end. All for One angrily balks that the winner is the one who lives the longest, as the ghost finally vanishes. U.S.J. Traitor Arc. Tomura returns back to the League's secret base, screaming in pain. All for One tells him to calm down since their quirk factors are damaged and need to heal. However, Tomura just keeps yelling obscenities, and that as long as people remember All Might, he'll never know peace. All for One notes that how since their minds have fused, he shares Tomura's hatred, telling him even though they couldn't steal New Order, now that they've removed their greatest obstacle, they just need to take it easy for now. He tells the League to remain on standby for a bit longer, but Dabi responds against the idea, saying how he can't stand the sight of still seeing his dad flying around. All for One tells him that while they are very alike, they have one crucial difference. While Dabi may only have one goal firmly in his mind, he's planned out many different routes over the decades, all to eventually reach his final goal. He tells him while they must wait for Tomura's body to be perfected again, now that Izuku has returned to the fortified UA, he mentions the other thing Dabi lacks, friends to spare. He promptly goes to contact the Aoyamas once again, with the order for Yuga to isolate Izuku somewhere so they can get him. Dabi asks All for One whether it'll be a problem if his friends get caught, but he simply says it won't be at all. If his friends succeed, he'll be rejoiceful, but if they fail, it's just a brief disappointment before moving on to the next plan. His friends are merely just disposable tools that he wants to glean the most amount of excitement as they can. Sometime later, All for One sees Spinner checking in on Tomura's progress, which has turned him into a monstrous mutated body, before transforming transforming back into Tomura himself. All for One tells Spinner not to worry as his recovery is progressing smoothly, gradually overcoming the Quirk singularity. Spinner asks if he's still Tomura, which he claims he is. All for One and Skeptic proceed to convince Spinner to take on the role as the commander of the Paranormal Liberation Front, to liberate the heteromorphic villains to their cause. Reluctantly taking on the role, All for One confidently states to him that everybody can be somebody's hero. Final War Arc. In the preparation for the upcoming battles, All for One offered up additional quirks to the members of the League. Dabi declined, but Spinner accepted. Having determined that Kurogiri was being held at Central Hospital, and him not only being the high-end Nomu closest to perfection, and with his Warp Gate quirk being instrumental for their success, he tasks Spinner with freeing him. He gives him 2 quirks, Body Bulk and Scale Mail, both of which will give him the strength, defense, and appearance of a true leader, commanding an army of heteromorphs consisting of Paranormal Liberation Front members and civilians to storm the hospital. He also gives him a recording device containing his and Tomura's voices to wake him up, and in case that fails, implants a micro device in Nana Shimura's stuffed hand, which will reactivate him once given. For the next several days, All for One continues to watch over Class 1A using the search quirk, seeing their fruitless efforts and attempting to track him down. Believing that the time is right, he prepares the next part of his plan and contacts the Ayamas. He thinks about how lies don't work on him thanks to a quirk that he stole back during the first era of quirks, which has grown stronger due to his mix of other quirks. He recalls the original owner being a disappointment, however his descendant had become much more impressive, even working alongside All Might to bring him down. Either way, he figures the quirk will bring him victory. He calls up the Ayama family asking for a 40-year Makalin, which they agree will be aged 16 years and that their son will deliver. He asks for their son's contact info, which they agree to. All for One senses no ill will, lies, or deception, meaning they're telling the truth through their coded conversation, and All Prepared is ready to meet up tomorrow. He then calls up Yuga, who through no deception in his voice informs All for One of the meeting place and where he will lure Izuku to. In an abandoned parking lot outside of UA, All for One finally re-emerges in front of Izuku after Yuga deliberately lured him out in the opening successfully. He thanks Yuga for delivering Izuku as promised, asking how terrifying it was to betray his friend, and congratulating him on his big speech about his goals, having also promised his family a blessed existence in this new world. Unfortunately for him, Yuga overcomes his fear against him and turns against All for One, attacking him with his naval laser. All for One is caught off guard by the attack while Yuga hides in Izuku's smokescreen, with the two noting how he completely fell for their trap, and Yuga declaring for his mom, dad, and everyone else's sake that he'll fight him. All for One is disappointed and confused, having not sensed any lies or ill intent in their conversation, unsure of how they deceived him. Annoyed, All for One states that even if it was a setup, he doesn't care because his prize is within reach. All for One is so close up to him, and using search, he knows all the heroes Tomura fought in the war are miles away. So he uses his warping quirk to summon the Paranormal Liberation Front to overwhelm One for All and finally seize his prize. However, All for One is once again taken aback when he spots Kurogiri's warp gate starting to appear behind them, wondering how they activated him. He thinks this saves him the trouble of getting him back, only to spot Neto Monoma appearing from one of them. As the heroes begin emerging from the gates, Yuga declares All for One the one thing he knows he fears most is that Japan isn't finished, and if they can lead the way, it will inspire the rest of them. So today is the day where he falls. The second war has begun, and the heroes and villains rush out to attack each other. All for One wonders if they plan on fighting in an all-out brawl when All Might activates the Troy defense system as cages emerge from beneath the battlefield, capturing all the villains in individual metal containers. All for One knows they're aware that they could just break through them easily until he realizes what their plan is. Just as they're all about to bust out after a few seconds, that gave the heroes just enough time to summon several more warp gates around the cages, allowing the heroes to shove them all in, separating the villains. All for One and some of the villain army are teleported to the ruins in the Gunga Mountain Villa, where Endeavor and a squad of heroes corner him. Hawks attempts to strike All for One straight in the head with his quirk, but failing to get through his mask. The heroes recognize All for One's warping quirk from the Camino incident to be inferior to Kurogiri's warp gate, taking it all into account while they built the UA barrier, and now his hubris would now lead to his downfall. All for One mocks the heroes' plan to split them up, pointing out that dividing their forces due to the decline in heroes was necessary, while also noting that the supposed ill-fated decision to pit One for All against Tomura, and worst of all to have Shoto face off against Dabi, with All for One criticizing Endeavor for having his youngest son clean up his mess and continuing his abuse towards the oldest. As the fighting continues, Endeavor and the heroes receive word that Dabi has been defeated by Shoto, causing him to react. In response, All For One comments on Endeavor's face, taunting him that he allowed his youngest son to take the burden of defeating his eldest sibling. Hawks tells Endeavor not to listen, expecting his upcoming verbal assault, while All For One continues berating him for not even looking at Toya and letting Shoto handle everything, confidently stating that's why he'll never win, as he prepares to attack with his arsenal of quirks. All For One attacks Endeavor with crescent-shaped projectiles, which he manages to block with Hell's Curtain. Hawks shoots some of his feathers through the fire, aimed at All For One's helmet. All For One deduces their strategy and realizes that the two heroes are coordinating their attacks together to destroy his life support mask as he blocks the feather attack. Hawks attempts to attack from behind, but All For One once again blocks the attack and taunts the number 2 hero, stating that even Recovery Girl couldn't save all his feathers and that he needs to use prosthetics in order to be at his top speed, but Hawks just laughs him off. Hawks flies away just as Endeavor comes in and attacks with Vanishing Fist. All For One notes that he can't block the attack with impact recoil and that Endeavor's heat is passing right through his hard flame fan shield. However, he also notices that Endeavor's attacks aren't quite on the same timing as Hawks' attacks. He uses this opportunity to further taunt Endeavor for not being completely focused on their battle, and asks him if he's thinking about Shoto and Dabi. He then reveals that he's had his eye on Endeavor for decades, as Endeavor tried his hardest to surpass All Might. He then finishes his taunts by asking Endeavor about not finding Toya's body, revealing his role in the disappearance. This enrages Endeavor, who screams at All For One and attacks, only for the villain to take a massive slice at Endeavor's side with a big quirk protrusion on his arm. Endeavor falls to the ground below as Hawks charges at All For One. He prepares to obliterate Nagant's replacement with a massive air cannon blast, only for Hawks to be saved by Heartbeat Wall, courtesy of arriving Earphone Jack flying on top of Tsukiyomi. All For One disgustingly refers to the two students as gnats, referring to how in the comic that he had read as a kid, there were always side characters that only existed to be killed by the Demon King as a show of power. Earphone Jack confidently brushes him off, telling him to save the insults until he's actually defeated them. As the two student heroes in training join the battle against All For One, he notes that he needs to get back to his other self, and realizes that the heroes are going to try and buy time for Endeavor to get back up and join the fight. He turns his attention to Earphone Jack, deducing her as the weakest link in their group, and attacks her by shooting several heads at her. Hawks manages to use his feathers to save her, and then lands another strike on All For One's helmet with his sword. All For One notices and taunts Earphone Jack for showing fear, chastising her for seeing this fight as just another lesson from school, calling her a mere extra. He prepares a massive blast attack with his left arm and simultaneously holds back Hawks with rivets from his right arm. His attack lands on Earphone Jack, blasting one of her earphone jacks off. Despite the pain, she relents, decrying All For One's beliefs, and fights back with her Heartbeat Surround legato ultimate move. The attack barely phases All For One, who further taunts her for such an underwhelming attack. Suddenly, he's held back within the vestige world of his quirk, as the vestiges of the quirks he has stolen over the years begin fighting back, restraining All For One and making him unable to use any quirks. All For One comments on how even New Order wasn't able to achieve this, wondering how they were spurred on by such weaklings. This leaves him open for an attack as Hawks, aided by Earphone Jack's Soundwave attack, lands another blow on All For One, shattering a piece of his life support mask. As All For One is still stunned, Tsukiyomi uses Dark Shadow to land another massive strike on All For One's shattered mask, successfully destroying it. As All For One ends up stunned by the attack, he notes that his awareness and reaction time is off due to the vestiges within his quirk rebelling against him. He realizes that since he gave up his original quirk to Tomura and is using a synthetic copy, his authority over his quirk has lessened. Within his vestige world, he begins to eat the other vestiges trying to rebel against him in order to reclaim control. Outside, Hawks prepares to land a killing blow, only for All For One to angrily unleash a massive burst of rivet stabs in all directions. Hawks is caught in the attack and severely injured, while All For One uses the opportunity to reassemble all the broken pieces of his life support mask in an attempt to put it all together. Suddenly, Endeavor re-enters the fight, fighting through all the rivets. Even as he loses an arm, with All For One taunting him for his doggedness, Endeavor persists and creates a massive flame fist where his arm used to be and smashes All For One, once again shattering his mask. All For One manages to barely protect himself from Endeavor's surrounding fire. He thinks about how he knew he might go hard on him, but never expected Endeavor would be the one to make him relive the pain he had when he originally faced All Might, reminding himself that a wounded hero is always the scariest. He's then caught off guard as Endeavor closes the distance, unleashing a vanishing jet burn attack, blasting him downwards onto the Gunga Mountain battlefield. Before he has time to fight back, Endeavor blasts him downwards, grabbing him and dragging him all throughout the forest. Due to his mask being destroyed and his body not listening to him, him, All For One tries to grab Endeavor and steal his quirk, but he proceeds to shoot fire from his eyes, burning his hand. Endeavor states that all his hands do is ruin people's futures, to which All For One claims that he does too, but to which Endeavor simply agrees. Blasting his way into the air, and despite All For One's attempts to stop it, Endeavor unleashes a prominence burn, engulfing All For One completely and reducing him to a crisped corpse. All For One is seemingly dead for good, but suddenly he begins to speak, asking Endeavor if he believed he would show up to the big battle empty-handed. With his body having served its purpose and destined to be scrapped anyway, he's decided to test something out. As an eye and an ear begin to emerge from the villain's head, with a grinning smile on his face, All For One asks what made him think heroes were the only ones to make sacrificial moments, and that villains are also scariest while wounded. Meanwhile, Tomura, whose mind has almost completely fused, has been fighting off a group of heroes at the floating UA fortress, overwhelming them with his immense strength and growth courtesy of the Quirk singularity. However, upon his confrontation with Lemillion, claiming that he doesn't have any friends, the deep spirit of Tenko Shimura reawakens, causing Tomura to hysterically rebuke his claim. This action causes the All For One side of the personality to retake control, realizing that despite him supposedly being fully assimilated, he can sense that Tenko has not fully melded together yet. Knowing that they can't let the action continue on any longer, Tomura heads over to try and finish off Katsuki in order to enrage Izuku once he finally arrives. The heroes continue to try and throw everything they can at the villain, but it proves fruitless to stop him. An incredibly injured Katsuki then steps up once again and utilizes his speed to dodge and evade each of Tomura's attacks up close. Tomura's actions begin to get more hectic, wondering why he's getting so pissed off and panicking by an extra who doesn't possess One For All, causing All For One to suddenly have a flash of memory to the second user of One For All. Despite the quick movements, Tomura is able to land a hit right in Katsuki's chest, bursting his heart and seemingly killing him for good. While the heroes panic over Katsuki's lifeless body, Tomura laughs that they've come prepared with the perfect demon lord body for the final boss, and that this is their story, the villain's tale. Despite his domination, the heroes continue to put up a fight, with Edgeshot attempting to revive Katsuki from the inside. All of this makes Tomura increasingly more unstable, causing him to undergo another transformation with his entire body compromised of fingers. This new increased strength is able to overwhelm the remaining active heroes, but Lemillion is able to distract Tomura for long enough for the electromagnetic barrier to be opened, allowing Izuku to join the battle, slingshotting into Tomura with a smash. Upon being sent backwards, Tomura notices that Izuku is stronger now, with All For One recognizing the glow around him as being the quirk of the third user. Izuku then realizes the fate of all the heroes, with Tomura ready to take advantage of his imminent emotional duress to counter him. However, Lemillion steps in to calm Izuku down, and back under his own control, Izuku confronts All For One, asking if Tomura is still in there. Tomura simply responds that he no longer exists. Tomura and All For One have fully merged into a new being, and supposedly due to him being older, All For One is currently in charge, saying that despite whatever he's scheming, he won't get his ideal ending. But then, Lemillion tells Izuku about what happened earlier when he spoke harshly to him, which caused him to throw a fit as if he were a child, figuring he isn't fully merged. The more he was provoked, the more unstable he became, which starts to irritate Tomura. Seeing the disembodied faces of the Shimura family on his left arm, Izuku and Nana Shimura realize that Tomura is still in there, causing Tomura to retaliate. Jumping into the air with all of his power, shaking the entire fortress, Tomura charges at Izuku, angrily declaring that he's taking back One For All. His smash erupts throughout the whole battlefield, but Izuku is able to stop the attack, telling All For One that he's the one who won't get his ideal ending. He uses a combination of Black Whip and Fajin to create the Black Chain, wrapping it around Tomura's arm and sending him flying. Tomura attempts to try and wrestle the chain off, not intending to fall for the same move again, only to be surprised when Izuku undoes it himself. He then notices Izuku concentrating, when suddenly, in the blink of an eye, he appears under Tomura, punching him with such tremendous speed and sending him flying upward. Tomura is completely caught off guard by the attack, realizing its strength and speed is different than the glow he was using before, and that he's currently using a different quirk, the one of the second user, Gear Shift. Thanks to its ability to let the user shift and change the target's speed when touched, Izuku enables Gear Shift Overdrive, turning his 100% power into 120. Yoichi declares to his brother that today is the day they finally end things, as Izuku unleashes a fully powered Detroit Smash directly into Tomura's stomach. Seeing the power of Gear Shift causes All For One to recall back to his encounter with the second user of One For All, when his meta ability was only able to work on small objects, being nothing more than a pea shooter. He states that all he was meant to be was an insect in his path, becoming further enraged at how much the power's grown, just as he and Tomura Tomura are able to see the vestiges of One for All around Izuku. After crashing into the battlefield, Izuku comes at them with a Detroit Smash quintuple, knocking them further down. Tomura notes that the attack wasn't as strong due to him not having built up glow. Despite being too fast to see, he figures he can predict his next attack based on the previous timing. However, he misses the swing as Izuku shifts into low gear at the last moment. Tomura attempts to counter again, but Izuku uses danger sense to detect the threat and immediately blocks his vision with smokescreen. He then uses float to quickly rise into the air, restraining and reeling Tomura up with Black Whip, preparing to combine the powers stored up thanks to the quintuple attack with Fajin, executing another blast of overdrive with Gear Shift, unleashing the full might of One for All. The second user states that their meta abilities were never what All for One should have been worried about. Rather, he should fear the reason why someone chooses to use their gifts. True power lies in an individual's intent, which is why people call them quirks. Izuku declares that he's giving it all he's got, telling All for One that he won't let him hurt anyone else, and despite Tomura's screams in defiance, Izuku pounds him with his ultimate smash, breaking many of his fingers apart. As Tomura's body falls with a gaping hole in his chest, Yoichi states how One for All and All for One have begun to resonate with each other, able to see his brother within as the vestiges of Tenko, Tomura, and All for One attempt to recover from all the damage. He continues to say that what Lemillion said is correct, that the course of the battle and the events that led to this moment has shaken the balance of their melding. Meanwhile, Tomura laments over Izuku not holding anything back and using all of his quirks, while he hasn't been able to use a single quirk yet, unable to show the true power of his body, all because of Eraserhead's erasure, the UA coffin, and their underhanded tricks. Just then, his body starts to undergo another transformation as the massive hole in his chest begins to swell and expand. Back at the mountains, All for One is revealed to have used his trump card that is the reverse-engineered quirk-destroying drug, rewinding his body back to his prime state. He tells Endeavor and Hawks that while the heroes managed to keep the villains on the defensive during the previous war, it won't be the same now, since heroes are those who defend, villains are those who violate, and they will plunge headlong into their dream. He further compliments Endeavor, not thinking he'd have to play this card against him, and with how light his body feels, he swiftly makes his way down to the battlefield, stealing the quirks of nearby heroes, as well as their capes to cover his nudity. Hawks quickly pushes a hero away, while All for One reveals that after using the drug's rewind effect, he's doomed to vanish, but since his dream has already been passed on to Tomura, he intends to rescue him from the hero's trap before he's gone. Hawks, attempting to stall for time, asks All for One what his dream is after obtaining One for All. All for One explains that he was influenced by comic books, and asks Hawks why villains are feared over the world. Hawks responds it's because they do bad things, but All for One states that in a world full of different cultures and values, those bad things would be an action that the masses react to in disgust. It's something that thwarts the future that they envision. It's because of this that All for One wants to thwart the future of the world, as it's all he's ever wished for. He declares that if everything that's happened will spell out victory or defeat for all, then victory still lies within his grasp. To add further cause to his ideals, All for One declares that people's experiences when they're young define who they become, referring to Spinner's dark upbringing, so his feelings for the friends who accepted him are strong. He reveals his plan to have Spinner free Kurogiri while mentioning he installed a microchip in Nana Shimura's hand to make sure he was active no matter what state he was in. As two warp gates appear above the battlefield, he yells that Spinner has succeeded. Dabi gleefully emerges from one of them saying hi to his dad, while from the other emerges Himiko, now transformed into Twice, calling out to Hawks. All for One states that the sad man's death gave rise to the hatred in Himiko's heart, further aided by Dabi in his quest for revenge, giving her the tool she needed to destroy all. He tells Hawks to watch and see what will happen if he hadn't made his death his top priority before, causing Hawks to panic. Right before Hawks could attack Himiko, she unleashed Sad Man's parade all over the battlefield, swarming the heroes with thousands of doubles. With the heroes now in full retreat, All for One laughs as this is going on, thinking about how this chain of events is working in his favor, and figuring that Kurogiri warped himself to Tomura's location. He also thinks about how he should think about obtaining the Warp Gate quirk for himself, as it's far superior to his sludge warping quirk. He attempts to use the chaos as cover and blast over to Tomura himself, but Hawks blocks him, asking him why he's in such a rush to leave even despite the rewind effect, realizing that he doesn't have faith in Tomura's perfect body. Annoyed by Hawks' cleverness, All for One responds that he's right, the body isn't complete, but that he's still essential for the process. Hawks cries out to Endeavor that since their divide and conquer plan was a bust, if things fall apart now, it will eventually reach Deku and Tomura, so they need to stop Dabi now. All for One attempts to lambast Hawks by reminding him that Endeavor's already lost an arm and that he's supposed to be trying to stop him rather than abandoning his duty. But Hawks smugly responds that he's already lost to him once. Back at UA, thanks to Kurogiri and the Twice doubles, Shota and Nato are attacked, undoing Erasure, causing Tomura to unleash a massive explosion, explosion, destroying most of the UA fortress. However, as a result of the massive damage done to his body, the All-for-One vestige loses control of it, still attempting to recover while Tomura re-emerges from his skin within. As All-for-One struggles to retake control, Tomura attempts to attack, but both his arms are shot off by Lady Nagant, sniping from atop the hospital below. All-for-One, within Tomura, hysterically cries out to her, lambasting her for trying to play the victim after murdering her fellow heroes, only to be shut up by Tomura, who unleashes a horde of fingers out of his mouth. All-for-One realizes too late that his control over Tomura has started to wane as Tomura laughs, asking if his attempts at manipulation have failed and mocking his current state. He further criticizes his attempts at grooming him, using All Might and Nanoshimura to irritate him, scheming to hijack his body and soul to attempt to absorb his hatred and steal One for All. However, as they merged together and became part of him, Tomura admits that he hated all of it, so he hid his own core deep within his own soul, and without him noticing, he's been reclaiming himself from the inside out, both body and spirit, and desires to follow the path towards his origin. Infuriated, All-for-One tries to command Kurogiri to transport him to his other self at the Gunga Mountains, but Kurogiri begins to stutter, unable to comply. Tomura decided that he doesn't need One for All and that he won't let himself be controlled anymore. Breaking free of All-for-One's vestige, he states that his heart won't waver, and that everything that exists in the world led to the existence of the house he grew up in. Now back in complete control, Izuku knocks Tomura outside UA, where they prepare to fight once again. With Tomura now free from his influence, All-for-One continues to try and escape Hawks' pursuit at Gunga. He explains how he was supposed to have full control over Tomura's body, and that the fusion and new personality weren't part of the original plan. He stated how he underestimated Tomura's desire for destruction, which was stronger than he anticipated, but nonetheless, all he has to do is get him to absorb his quirk factor and he will regain control of Tomura once again, allowing the creation of the Demon Lord to be complete. Hawks retorts back that it isn't his story but theirs, and not his to do as he pleases, as he continues to swipe at him and prevent him from escaping. All-for-One mocks that the winds are blowing his way and seemingly kills Hawks by destroying his body with a spatial distortion quirk. But then, suddenly, Hawks' face turns all glittery and simply fades away, revealing him to be an illusion created by Kami Utsushimi, who had arrived just in time with reinforcements from the hero students of Shiketsu High School. Inasa Yoarashi proceeds to unleash a massive whirlwind which sucks up all the twice doubles, as he declares he is the one who decides which way the wind blows. With the Shiketsu High School students joining as backup, the heroes throw their full assault into attacking All-for-One to prevent him from escaping. He touches one of the twice doubles only for it to melt, thinking to himself how he can only steal a quirk by touching the user's body directly, and while they only attacked him with 2 people at first to avoid that risk, now they've become desperate that they're willing to accept the risk, which he smiles wickedly at. Despite the arrival of reinforcements, All-for-One still manages to overpower every one of them. Using several thorns extending from his back, he unleashes a massive laser explosion, decimating the battlefield below. The heroes, however, stand their ground to keep their defense strong and continue attacking, especially now that he stopped running away. All-for-One monologues, asking what makes them think they will emerge this time, that they lost the only one who could face him head on, and how ignorant he believes they are, with none of them having been born from his golden dark age where his powers are at his peak, with some of them only having witnessed All Might's rise to power, and most being born when he reigned supreme. All-for-One tells them that he has lived in the era when people trembled in fear of something lurking in the darkness, when they were all tainted by suspicion, resentment, exploitation, and prejudice, and how it was his golden dark age. Inasa proceeds to attack him with his whirlwind and berates him, retorting that they knew about that period through history class, and that he's decided to root for Endeavor and Shoto, believing hot-blooded passion will always triumph over fear. In response, All-for-One decides to try and steal some quirks, unleashing another hell of rivet stabs that manage to slice part of Inasa's face. Despite being injured, Inasa continues fighting and states his quirk is even stronger on windy days, and that instead of All-for-One's ancient glory days, he'd rather see a future built by the people he's cheering on. With the heroes throwing their attacks into the whirlwind cage, All-for-One becomes irritated at the look in their eyes, looking past him and are constantly stoking the flames even after the light has gone out. He rebuked that it's all for naught since they won't come too close, for fear he'll steal their quirks. However, he then suddenly feels an ominous presence from behind him and is stunned into silence as a massive dark shadow emerges. All-for-One then realizes what it was that made him tense up when he was faced against this being earlier. Now completely immersed in total darkness thanks to the dark clouds blocking the sunlight, the flames dying up by the rainstorm, and covering himself in the earth to pile up the darkness, Fumikage tells All-for-One that even darkness comes in a range of shadows, and now they've already devoured the filthy darkness that he brought as he reveals Dark Shadow's giant monstrous form as his total release of full power. Fumikage tells him what All Might said, how he can't steal Endeavor's quirk just by touching his flames, which is why he was tasked with supporting them, since he can't steal the quirk just by touching Dark Shadow. Fumikage proceeds to use Dark Shadow boosted by Inasa's whirlwind to unleash black abyss, Light of Balder, pulverizing All For One into the ground. Fumikage continues his assault on All For One, but eventually he's able to retaliate by unleashing a massive nuclear explosion that blasts away Dark Shadow, greatly diminishing him once again. All For One states how obnoxious they all are, and as a result of the rewind effect, he's become visibly younger and more powerful. Now free, All For One uses his quirks to blast away out of the battlefield. The heroes give chase, with Inasa carrying them on his wind, refusing to let him escape, when to everyone's surprise, Gigantomachia suddenly appears. All For One smiles, commanding him to finish them, but instead the beast throws a giant mountain boulder directly at his master, much to his surprise. All For One is infuriated, cursing out the insects who were on Gigantomachia's back, Eijiro Kirishima and Hitoshi Shinso, who is currently brainwashing Machia. As he continues to be bombarded on all sides, All For One realizes that Hitoshi is the one controlling the behemoth. Deducing Hitoshi's quirk was how they were able to get the Aoyamas to deceive him, sarcastically commenting that it is his tactic. All For One proceeds to fire off a huge wave, blasting Gigantomachia and Hitoshi. Although Eijiro was successfully able to defend Hitoshi, All For One succeeded in seemingly breaking free of his control over Machia. However, even though Machia responds that he can recognize All For One's scent as his master despite looking different, he proceeds to ask why he was left behind. When All For One doesn't respond, Machia tearfully then yells that even after he came back in Tomura's body, despite having faith and waiting for him all the years since he went into hiding, he still abandoned him and ran away. Full of anger and rage, Machia turns against All For One and viciously attacks him, as he plus the heroes throw their full assault on All For One until he vanishes for good. Despite everyone's continued relentless assault, pushing his body to the absolute brink, All For One manages to find an opening to retaliate, sending a blast forward that slices Mount Lady's stomach, causing her body to fall to the ground. He then turns to his former bodyguard, calling him a dog that must be put down, sending a giant blast of lightning, destroying half of Gigantomachia's entire body, knocking him down as well. Due to his rapidly advancing rewind, his corpse continues to accelerate and regenerates at the instant, as All For One comments that possibly due to the interference of his other self, there is something dark welling up inside of him, that the younger he is, the more untamable it grows. Unleashing another powerful light blast, he destroys Dark Shadow and eviscerates Hawks and Fumikage, stating that the more he gives into the darkness, the more he can draw out his quirk's true potential. After destroying Dark Shadow, All For One proceeds his onslaught to massacre the heroes who attacked him, reminiscing on how much joy he was having being young. As the dust settles, all the heroes lie battered, broken, bleeding to death, or dead. With the majority of the heroes and Gigantomachia now incapacitated, All For One chokes the barely conscious Hawks by the throat, with the latter stabbing him with his sword. All For One brushes off the sword and tells him to step aside, as he plans to steal Fumikage's quirk as retribution for all the trouble he caused him. Despite his persistence, Hawks continues to fruitlessly resist, as All For One steals Fierce Wings for himself, noting that even with its quirk factor seriously damaged, he still managed to put up a good fight. Hawks comments on how his stockpiled quirks work outside his body and don't mesh well while he's rewinding, and that the damage is hastening the process, mocking him as a result. Just then, Minoru Mineta throws one of his pop-off balls at All For One's leg, weakly telling him not to steal Dark Shadow or else he'll become an edgelord, and that he should steal his quirk instead, begging him not to take it from Fumikage. All For One sees the look in his eyes, thinking about the howls of the weak, and decides not to waste another second and throws the powerless Hawks away to leave the battlefield. Flying into the air, he tells the heroes that thanks to the press's arrival, people are going to see what happened, and they'll know that they failed again since they couldn't protect a single thing, blasting away to reach Tomura. All For One continues to speed through the ruins of Edo City, quickly approaching being within range of Tomura to use his warping quirk on him. However, he's surprised to see none other than his former nemesis, All Might, standing in the middle of the highway with his car in a briefcase. All Might asks out loud about their endless warring, further stating that they have realized Tomura's hatred has started to affect him and his main body, which means he won't be able to ignore him. With All For One closing in, All Might declares his signature "I am here," unleashing an array of support items and weapons from his car and briefcase, as All For One can't help but look down, grinning with madness in his eyes, as the two old foes prepare to settle things once and for all.
Did you enjoy our video? Well then be sure to check out these other great videos from the Amagi, and make sure to subscribe and ring the bell to get notified about our latest videos.